So it's delightful to come out from behind the sort of control booth to give the first of the 3 talks on the great stages of the threefold path of ethics, meditation and wisdom. And as Silanatha said, I'm sure you've all encountered this before. So over the next 15 and a bit minutes, I'm going to cover the following things. So if we could have our first slide, please, Silanatha. Thanks. So I'm going to start by looking at one of the origins of the 5 precepts. So we usually associate the precepts with the practice of ethics. I'm going to share a couple of descriptions of the place and importance of ethics in our own tradition of Triratna. I'm going to talk about my own practice of ethics, and I am going to talk about it from a perspective of the myth of self-development, which Silanatha talked so clearly about yesterday. And then finally, I'm going to provide what for me are some inspiring examples of just how beautiful and profound an ethical life can be. So if we move on to our next slide. So we have here an extract from an account from the Pali Canon, from the Anguttara Nikaya, where the Buddha elucidates what is translated as 8 streams of merit, streams of wholesome nutriments of happiness, heavenly, ripening in happiness, conducive to heaven, that lead to what is wished for, desired, and agreeable to one's welfare and happiness. And what the Buddha then goes on to describe, as you can see from the slide, are going for refuge to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, and then a formulation of the 5 precepts, which I'm sure we're all pretty familiar with. So our practice of the precepts has its root right back to the Buddha. Thanks, Silanatha. And in his book, Living Ethically, Sangharakshita describes the precepts as making up a path of practice rather than being a list of fixed rules or rigid prohibitions. And he says that an ethical precept isn't an absolute in the sense of being something we're either observing or not observing. And actually, as long as we're living with the precepts in mind, our practice can always be worse and it can always be better. And in one sense, this can be quite liberating, particularly if we're someone who dislikes rules or the sense that somebody else is telling us what to do and how to behave. But he also goes on to suggest that we can consciously or unconsciously let ourselves off the hook a little. And how might we do this? Well, we might do this by maybe being a little lax around our attempts to be a vegetarian, by allowing ourselves to use little white lies in the course of dealing with people in a business context, or maybe by convincing ourselves that by only drinking wine twice a week instead of daily, we've somehow ticked a box. So we need to be aware of how we're approaching the practice of ethics, and I'll say much more about my own personal practice later. In 1984, Bhante Sangharakshita gave a lecture on the 16th anniversary of the order, which was transcribed and edited into a book called The 10 Pillars of Buddhism. And in that book, he describes the 10 precepts which order members take at the time of their private ordination. Now, in case you're not familiar with the fact that order members are trying to observe additional precepts, essentially order members observe the 3 precepts relating to the body that you'll be familiar with in the same as the 5 precepts, 4 precepts relating to speech, and 3 precepts relating to the mind. So I'd like to talk about, share a couple of analogies that Sangharakshita used to talk about the importance of the precepts. So we'll have the first one. So going for refuge or commitment to the 3 jewels is one's lifeblood as a Buddhist. Observance of the precepts represents the circulation of that blood through every fiber of one's being. And coming from my experience of living out of the myth of development, I really love this analogy. So without blood, we wouldn't be able to live. Without the circulation of that blood, we'd also die. And there's something really active about the way in which we help the blood circulate through our practice of ethics. And the next analogy Bhante uses is to describe the path of ethics, meditation, and wisdom. So the 10 precepts are indeed the massy supports of the entire majestic edifice of the Dharma. Without the 10 precepts, the Dharma could not, in fact, exist. One might say that the 3 jewels are the 3-stepped plinth and foundation of the Dharma. The 10 precepts, the double row of pillars supporting the spacious dome, meditation, the dome itself, and wisdom, the lofty spire that surmounts the dome. And it's this last analogy that I wanted to say something about from a personal perspective. So I very much see my ethical practice as holding up and supporting the rest of my life. And the robustness, the strength, the effectiveness of each of those pillars is something that I spend quite a lot of time checking and maintaining. Thanks, Silanatha. So after Silanatha's talk yesterday, in this respect, I can really see the myth of development playing out in my life. And one way in which I get a sense of how things are going in this regard is in meditation, which can often be a reflection of my recent ethical behavior and observance of the precepts. And I like to imagine that those pillars that hold up my meditation, and in whatever way wisdom emerges for me, those pillars are made of the positive formulation of the precepts. In fact, that's where I try to direct my effort. So not solely focusing on abstaining from negative behavior, but with more emphasis on living out the positive qualities of kindness, generosity, contentment, integrity, and awareness, as well as kindly, helpful, harmonious speech, compassion, tranquility, and wisdom itself, as opposed to ignorance. And they're the 10 positive qualities within the precepts taken by order members. So I often feel I'm attending to my pillars, becoming aware that there's a little maintenance required, a little repointing, some filling of cracks maybe is needed. And sometimes I can become aware of this myself, but other times I need my close spiritual friends to point out defects and potential fault lines in the pillars of my ethical behavior. And my experience of observing the precept is that when things are going fine, when things seem to be in their right place, when the world, or perhaps more importantly, when everyone else is doing what I need them to do, following the precepts is actually pretty easy, I'd say. However, when I'm under pressure, when things go wrong, when the unexpected happens, when I feel I'm being unfairly criticized, or when people are making additional demands upon me, well, that's when my pillars come under a bit of pressure. And if I've neglected a particular pillar, that's when the trouble starts. So just to bring this to life, I wanted to give you an example of something that happened on Friday. So on Friday, I spoke unskillfully to someone and also about someone just before this retreat started. And if I look at the conditions surrounding this incident, I could say, well, I was feeling a lot of pressure. They were being very demanding. I felt a real weight of responsibility for hosting this weekend retreat. And really, it was just a reaction to that pressure that somebody else was putting on me. But that actually isn't true. The real pressure was all of my own making. It was all self-referential. It was all about me. And as someone pointed out to me this morning, it was all ego. So in a way, knowing that is quite good. But for me, there's a danger here in the knowledge that a reaction is just ego is just another excuse. So I can't leave it at that. I need to dig a bit deeper. And my assessment, as it is at the moment, is that I'd allowed my more instinctual survival conditioning to convince me that I was somehow under attack. And nowadays, fortunately, I no longer spend lots of time building Fortress Me with all my defenses and armaments, but occasionally I slip up and find myself with a metaphorical weapon in my hand, or more often in my mouth. So by remembering the guidelines of the precepts, and particularly remembering that ethics is about others, I can usually pretty quickly see what I'm doing. And I feel a deep sense of shame. And nowadays, I try to apologize quickly, let go of that weapon, and try to step back inside the shoes of others. Maybe the demands of the other person were also coming from a place of ego. And if so, they're just like me. So now I can experience their suffering and feel compassion towards them. And just a word about shame, in case you haven't come across this in a Buddhist context. Shame's a really positive emotion, and it helps us to see where we've fallen short of our own understanding and observance of the precepts. No one outside is criticizing me when I practice like this. And in a sense, I'm not actually criticizing myself. I'm recognizing where I've let myself down in my own eyes. So I don't dwell on these mistakes. I apologize, put things right where I need to, and then go back to work on shoring up whichever particular pillar has been exposed as being vulnerable, by trying to live more thoroughly through the positive formulation of the precepts. Anyway, so that's what it looks like when it goes wrong for me. What does it look like when we start to consistently embody the positive qualities of the precepts? When those pillars of positive qualities start to shine and sparkle? And I want to share with you 3 examples from our refuge tree of inspiration. If you're not familiar with the refuge tree, just ask an order member or someone else who's training for ordination. And the first 2 of these are from our teachers of the present. So if we can have the first one, Silanatha. So this is Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche. So you might have heard that name because this was the lovely reading that Akasha Hridaya gave in the puja last night. It was one of Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche's readings. And he was also one of Sangharakshita, our founder's teachers, and he was head of one of the Tibetan schools of Buddhism, and he actually died in 1991. So we're talking quite contemporary here. So apart from being one of Sangharakshita's teachers, he was also one of the Dalai Lama's teachers. And what I'd like to read is a description of him by the Dalai Lama. Despite his wide renown and large following, Khyentse Rinpoche always remained very gentle and humble. His deep spiritual experience was obvious, but he was never proud of his knowledge. This is something quite remarkable. He was equally kind to all, whether high or low, and it is true to say that he was never heard to say anything that would bring hurt or pain to others. I'm not going to make any comments about these because I think they stand for themselves. So the next one is Dado Rinpoche, another of Bante's teachers who died a year earlier in 1990. And we have a number of stupas at various Sriratna retreat centers which contain relics of Dado Rinpoche. Akasha Hridaya is extremely fond and knowledgeable about Dado Rinpoche. So if you want to know more, ask him. So I've got 2 quotes. The first comes from Naga Bodhi, one of our senior order members who met Dado Rinpoche on a number of occasions. Each time we came together, the room, the air, the entire world actually felt somehow sweeter, as if permeated by a subtle form of honey. I had never experienced anything like it, and I haven't since. And the second is from Vijayamala, one of our senior female order members, who also met Dado Rinpoche. Rinpoche's love radiated out, and as far as I am concerned, still radiates out from a central point which has no magnitude at all. There are no impurities to get in the way. What is left, therefore, is an uninterrupted stream of compassion that radiates across time and through space. When I get too literal about things, or I find myself looking for that big spiritual experience, I can bring to mind the extraordinary ordinariness of his presence. This gives me an almost tangible sense of what it could feel like to be at the same time full of emotion and yet completely unself-referential. I know it's possible. I've seen it. And I want to leave you with a famous story that you may have heard from another wonderful figure from our great refuge tree of inspiration, this time from one of the teachers of the past. So this is the 17th, 18th century Zen master Hakuin. And just to condense this story a little. So at one time, Hakuin, who was greatly loved and respected by his many disciples, lived in a hermitage near a village. Now, the beautiful daughter of a couple in the village fell pregnant, and her parents demanded to know who the father was. And eventually she names Hakuin. So the girl's mother takes the baby and goes to Hakuin and accuses him of being the child's father. I kind of put myself in that position and wonder what response I would give. And all he says is that so? So the woman gives the baby to Hakuin, who seems completely undisturbed and starts to care for the child. And his reputation, of course, is ruined. His disciples desert him. And about a year later, the mother of the child admits that Hakuin isn't the father and that it was some other boy from the village. So again, the girl's mother visits Hakuin, this time full of remorse, and apologizes, but asks for the baby to be returned. Now, Hakuin has clearly cared for the child as his own, become very fond of him, and he simply replies, "Is that so?" and hands the baby to them. So apart from feeling wholly inadequate when I hear a story like that, it also makes me realize that it is possible to be ethical in the face of any situation. And that's a real inspiration for me. And that's why I keep polishing my ethical pillars. Thank you.